Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. The air was filled with excitement and the scent of spring flowers as I arrived at the community park early on Easter Sunday. The event I had signed up to volunteer for was the annual Easter egg hunt, a tradition that brought together families and children of all ages. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, eager to help out and be part of something that brought so many people together. The park was already bustling with activity as volunteers set up tables, arranged decorations, and prepared the eggs for the hunt. It was a sunny morning, and I could hear the sound of children laughing and running as they anxiously awaited the start of the event. The organizers had hidden hundreds of colorful plastic eggs around the park, each filled with candy or small toys, ready to be discovered by eager little hands. I was assigned to the egg stuffing station, where I would help fill the eggs with candy and prizes, making sure there were enough for every child who participated. It was simple work, but it felt good to contribute to something that would bring so much joy to the community. As I worked, I couldn't help but smile at the sight of the children running around, searching for eggs with their baskets. The excitement was contagious, and the energy in the air was palpable. Every few minutes I would look up and see a child triumphantly holding an egg above their head, shouting with glee as they added it to their basket. It was hard not to get swept up in the festive atmosphere, and for a moment I forgot about everything else as I focused on my task. Around mid-morning, a small group of children approached the table where I was working, their faces glowing with anticipation. They were clutching their baskets, eager to refill them with more eggs. I smiled and handed them each a couple of eggs to add to their collection. As they ran off, I glanced down at the eggs I was holding in my hand, checking them to make sure they were properly sealed before I placed them in the baskets. It was during this routine check that I felt something strange. I had just cracked open an egg to inspect its contents when I noticed something unusual inside. Instead of the usual candy or small toy, there was something white and hard. At first, I thought it was a small piece of plastic, perhaps a broken toy or a piece of chalk. But as I carefully examined it, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't plastic. It was a tooth, an actual, real human tooth. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the tooth in disbelief. I had seen all sorts of things in my life, but never had I come across something like this. I immediately felt a wave of unease wash over me. How could a tooth end up in an Easter egg? Who would put something like that inside an egg, especially at a children's event? The tooth was small, and its shape was unmistakable, but there was no way I could know for sure if it had come from an adult or a child. I quickly scanned the surrounding area to see if anyone had noticed what I had found. There was no one nearby, and the children were still happily searching for eggs, oblivious to the strange discovery I had just made. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Should I report this? Was it some kind of sick joke? I didn't want to overreact, but I also knew that I couldn't just ignore it. I carefully placed the egg back in the basket and stood up, my mind racing. I didn't want to panic or make a scene, but I knew I had to get someone else involved. I walked briskly to the event coordinator, who was overseeing the hunt and making sure everything ran smoothly. She was speaking with a group of parents, and I hesitated for a moment before walking up to her. When I told her about the tooth in the egg, her face changed instantly. She became visibly concerned and immediately walked over to the table with me. Together, we opened the egg again, and she confirmed what I had found. She looked around the area, as if expecting someone to jump out and reveal it was some kind of prank. But no one was acting suspicious. The event continued as usual, with children running around and collecting eggs, oblivious to the unsettling discovery. The coordinator told me to gather all the eggs I had been working with and place them in a secure area so they could be inspected. I did as instructed, but my mind was still racing. How could someone put a tooth in an egg at a children's event? Was it intentional? Who would do such a thing? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, and the more uneasy I became. Something about the whole situation felt off, but I didn't know what it meant or who to trust. As the event continued, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The initial excitement among the children seemed to dwindle as the parents began to notice that something was wrong. Word spread quickly, and more concerned adults started gathering around the egg stuffing station, asking questions. The coordinator explained that there had been an incident with one of the eggs, but assured everyone that everything was under control. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. What if there were more eggs with strange items inside? What if there was someone in the crowd trying to do something dangerous? The worst part was that I couldn't help but feel responsible. I had been the one to handle the eggs before they were hidden. What if I had missed something? What if the tooth had been in one of the other eggs that the children had already found? By the time the hunt was over, the park was filled with the sound of parents discussing what had happened. The coordinator had called the police to investigate the matter, and they arrived shortly after the event concluded. I watched as they took statements from the volunteers and parents, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. The police took the egg with the tooth in it for further examination, and I was told to leave the matter to the authorities. But the whole ordeal stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind long after I had returned home. The days following the Easter egg hunt were filled with an eerie silence. The police had launched an investigation, but I didn't hear anything concrete for a while. The event was the talk of the town, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some people said it was a prank, others suggested that it was part of a sick game, and some even believed it was the work of someone with sinister intentions. No one knew for sure, but it was clear that the discovery had shaken the entire community. A week later, I received a call from the police. They had managed to trace the tooth back to a dental office in the area, where it had been reported as missing after a routine extraction. It turned out that the tooth had been taken from the office by someone who had access to it, and it had somehow ended up in the Easter egg. The person responsible for placing the tooth in the egg was never caught, but the police assured me that the situation had been resolved, and there was no danger to the children or the community. Although the mystery was solved, the experience had left me shaken. I had volunteered to help create a fun, safe environment for children, but instead I had stumbled into something far more unsettling. It reminded me how important it was to be vigilant and aware of my surroundings, even in places where I expected to feel safe. In the end, the community continued to celebrate Easter, but the memory of that strange discovery stayed with me long after the event had ended. Story 2. The sun was shining through the dining room window when I arrived at the Easter brunch. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and glazed ham, and I could hear laughter from the backyard where kids were already hunting for eggs. I had been invited by a distant relative I barely saw throughout the year, but family traditions always pulled everyone together during the holidays. People bustled around setting the table, pouring juice and passing around plates of food. I smiled politely, hugging people I only recognized by name and face once or twice a year. I found a seat at the far end of the table, close to the patio door. Everyone was dressed in pastels, light floral patterns and soft colors that made the atmosphere feel cheerful. The kids eventually trickled back in from outside, their baskets overflowing with plastic eggs. Conversation buzzed around me, mostly small talk about work, school, and travel plans. Despite not being particularly close to anyone at the table, I felt the usual comfort that came from being surrounded by family. The brunch began with the usual chatter, forks clinking against plates, and compliments about how well everything was cooked. A relative at the head of the table stood to give a toast, as was customary for the family at each holiday gathering. I took a sip of my orange juice and leaned back slightly, expecting the usual sentimental speech about being thankful and grateful. The room quieted as everyone turned their attention to the person giving the toast. It started out normal enough, thanking everyone for coming and complimenting the food. Then, as casually as if discussing the weather, they mentioned they had done something awful many years ago. At first, no one reacted. It was vague, and most assumed it was a setup to a joke. But then they said the words that made my stomach drop. They confessed to having killed someone. There was a beat of silence around the table as everyone stared, not sure whether to laugh or be horrified. The person giving the toast kept talking, explaining in strange detail how it had happened. They said it had been an accident at first, but then admitted it had not been entirely unintentional. They spoke slowly, deliberately, not slurring or fumbling. It was not a drunken mistake or a mental lapse. It was a clear, planned confession. The room remained silent, with only the sound of a fork dropping somewhere near the center of the table. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I looked around to see how others were reacting. Most faces were frozen, pale, confused. One person whispered something to another, their eyes wide. The confessor looked calm, almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. No one moved. The air felt heavy, as if we were all waiting for someone to break the silence and say this was a joke. But no one did. Then one of the relatives stood up abruptly, shaking their head and saying they needed some air. Another followed. People began whispering, trying to figure out what to do next. I could see someone fumbling for their phone under the table. I kept my eyes on the confessor, who sat back down as if they had simply shared a story about their childhood. They began eating again like nothing had happened. The normal sounds of brunch slowly resumed, but everything felt off. The laughter and lightness were gone. No one brought up the confession directly. It was like a collective decision had been made to pretend it had not happened. But the tension never lifted. I excused myself and went to the bathroom just to breathe. My hands trembled as I leaned against the sink. I stared at myself in the mirror and wondered what kind of family event I had just walked into. I thought about leaving but felt trapped by the unspoken rules of politeness and tradition. When I returned to the table, conversation had resumed, but it was stiff and fragmented. No one looked at the confessor. It was as if they had become invisible. I tried to eat, but everything tasted like paper. My thoughts kept circling back to their words, trying to remember exactly what they said. Was it true? Was it a cry for help or attention? Or was it a real confession buried under years of silence? After the meal ended, people began to drift away, claiming they had errands or needing to get back home. I stayed behind to help clean up, hoping someone would mention it, would say something to make it all make sense. But no one did. It was like a spell had fallen over the house, and everyone was too afraid to speak the truth aloud. The confessor stayed seated, sipping coffee and staring into the distance, not saying a word. Eventually, I made my way out. On the drive home, I kept replaying the moment in my head. It felt like a scene from a movie, unreal and out of place in such a cheerful setting. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? That someone had confessed to a murder during an Easter toast. There was no victim's name, no timeline, no location. Just a quiet voice admitting something no one wanted to hear. That night, I could not sleep. The image of the confession kept replaying in my mind. I did some online searches for unsolved cases or old news articles that might match the vague details, but nothing stood out. The next morning, I called one of the relatives who had also been there and asked if they had thought about what happened. They hesitated, then admitted they had. But like me, they were not sure what to believe or how to respond. Over the next few days, I made more calls, slowly piecing together what I could. Eventually, one person shared something that changed everything. They said years ago, there had been a family friend who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. They had not been close, and the case had gone cold. It had always been a quiet rumor, something people whispered about but never discussed openly. Now, with the confession, it felt less like gossip and more like the truth. I decided to speak to the authorities after all. I told them about the brunch, the toast, the confession. I gave them every detail I could remember. They asked questions, and I answered them honestly. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. Then I got a call. The police had reopened a case from over 2 decades ago. The pieces were finally fitting together. The confession, however bizarre and unexpected, had brought new light to an old case. It turned out there had been enough evidence to link the confessor to the disappearance. The authorities had just needed someone to come forward, and my statement had been the missing piece. An arrest was made, and the family was shaken, but there was also a sense of relief. For years, there had been questions, suspicions, and now there were answers. The truth had come out in the most unusual way, but it had finally come out. The next Easter was quieter, smaller, more solemn, but there was a strange sense of peace, too. We had all lived with shadows we never acknowledged, and now they had been brought into the light. I still think about that brunch, about how one moment changed everything. And though it was unsettling, I am glad I was there to hear it. Sometimes the truth waits for the right moment, and sometimes it arrives in the middle of a toast. Story 3. It was a warm Saturday morning, the kind that always felt perfect for Easter egg hunting. I had decided to get an early start, hiding the colorful eggs in the backyard before the kids woke up. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, and the air smelled fresh with the promise of spring. I loved this time of year. It gave me a chance to watch the kids laugh and run around, finding the eggs I carefully placed in the bushes and under the garden tools. I had spent the past hour carefully choosing spots for each egg, some in plain sight, others tucked behind the shed or underneath a tree. The kids would have a blast looking for them later. As I moved along the edge of the backyard, I noticed something odd, a faint outline in the soil near the far corner. It was a small rectangular shape, barely noticeable beneath the grass and dirt. I squatted down, brushing away the earth with my hands, thinking it might be some old piece of junk I had forgotten about. The more I cleared, the more I realized this wasn't just random debris. There was a small box buried beneath the surface. It wasn't large, just a small, worn wooden box, like something you might find at an antique store. It was dirty, and the edges were frayed, as though it had been there for quite some time. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was something that had been left by the previous homeowners, a forgotten treasure, or perhaps just trash. I picked up the box, the weight of it surprising me as I dusted it off. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and I could feel the rough texture of the wood through my fingers. My curiosity piqued. I tried to open it, but the latch was stuck. I tugged at it, using my nails to pry it open, and after a few moments of effort, the latch finally gave way. Inside, I found something that made my stomach tighten: Polaroid photographs. At first, I didn't know what to think. I pulled one out, the edges curling slightly, and stared at the image. It was a picture of a group of people, but none of them were familiar to me. But I turned the photograph over, half expecting to find some explanation written on the back, but there was nothing. Just a blank space. I took a deep breath and pulled out another one, this time of a woman sitting in a chair, looking off to the side with a distant expression. The photographs seemed ordinary at first, just snapshots of people I didn't recognize. But as I looked closer, something about the images started to unsettle me. The more I flipped through the Polaroids, the more I realized they weren't just random strangers. They were all taken in places that looked eerily familiar. The backyard, the park nearby, even the local diner, the location seemed so ordinary, yet the faces in the pictures didn't belong to anyone I knew. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't understand it. How had these photos ended up in my backyard? Why were they buried in a box, hidden from sight for who knows how long? I carefully laid the photos out on the ground, looking at each one with growing anxiety. It wasn't just the strange people. There was something unsettling about the way the photos were taken. In every single one, the people were looking directly at the camera, but none of them were smiling. They all seemed distant, almost as if they knew they were being watched. I glanced around my backyard, the weight of the situation sinking in. It was an ordinary place, nothing special about it. But now, the space felt different. Every tree, every corner seemed to hold secrets that I couldn't understand. Had someone been watching me? Had someone been here before, taking these photos, hiding them just out of sight? The thought made my skin crawl. I looked down at the next photo, which showed a man standing near the old oak tree in the corner of the yard. I felt my heart race as I recognized the spot. It was the very tree I had just walked past a few minutes ago, hiding Easter eggs for the kids. The man in the photo was standing in the exact spot, but he looked like he had been there years ago, his clothes outdated and worn. How was that even possible? I picked up the last few photos from the box, my hands shaking now. Each one was a new mystery. A photo of a young child on the swing in the park down the street, a woman walking past the old coffee shop, a man standing on the sidewalk staring directly at the camera. The last photo in the box was the most disturbing of all. It was a close-up shot of someone's face, their eyes wide with fear, as if they had been caught off guard. And in the background, I could make out the faint outline of a house, my house. I sat down on the grass, overwhelmed. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who were these people? Why were there photos in my backyard? And how had someone been watching me without my knowledge? I felt like I was in a nightmare, and the only way out was to find the truth. I didn't know what to do next. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't even know how to explain what had happened. Who would believe that someone had been secretly photographing strangers and burying their pictures in my backyard? But as the minutes passed, I realized I had no choice. I needed help. I couldn't handle this alone. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the local police. When they answered, I explained the situation as best I could, trying to keep my voice steady. After a few minutes, the officer on the other end said they would send someone to investigate. I felt a small sense of relief, knowing that help was on the way, but also a gnawing fear that this was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. It didn't take long for the officers to arrive. They took the box of photos from me and asked me a series of questions about what had happened. I tried to explain everything, but the more I talked, the more confused I became. The officers seemed to think I was simply overreacting, that maybe it was just a prank or a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a harmless joke. There was something far darker at play here. The police took the photos for further investigation, promising to look into it. But as they left, they assured me that there was no immediate danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, and I knew I would never look at my backyard the same way again. The days passed, and life slowly returned to normal. But the Easter egg hunt happened as planned, with the kids running around and laughing, completely unaware of the strange discovery I had made. But the thought of those photos, and the eerie sense that I had been watched, lingered in the back of my mind. Weeks later, I received a call from the police. They had investigated the photos and found something that took me completely by surprise. The people in the pictures were part of a group of missing persons cases that had been unsolved for years. The images were recent, though, and they had been taken within the last few months. But what was even more unsettling was that the house in the last photo, the one in the background of the close-up shot, was part of an abandoned property just down the street. The police were continuing their investigation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something much darker than I could have ever imagined. As the weeks passed, the mystery remained unsolved, but the photographs were carefully stored away, and I couldn't help but wonder who had buried them in my backyard and why. Story 4. I had been hired for a local event, a fun Easter egg hunt that the community had organized for the children. I was excited because it was an opportunity to dress up as the Easter Bunny and bring some joy to the little ones. I'd done events like this before, and it was always such a fulfilling experience to see the kids' faces light up as they hunted for colorful eggs. The costume was a bit hot and uncomfortable, but it was worth it to see the happiness I brought to everyone. Little did I know, this event would take a dark turn. The event started out as expected. I bounced around from one group of excited children to the next, posing for pictures, handing out candy, and hiding plastic eggs filled with treats. The atmosphere was cheerful, and the laughter of the kids echoed across the park. Everything seemed perfect, and I was grateful for the chance to be a part of such a festive occasion. But as the afternoon wore on, something began to feel off. It started subtly at first. After posing with a group of kids for a photo, I reached down into one of their baskets to retrieve an egg, only to find a small folded note hidden under the colorful plastic eggs. At first, I thought it was just a harmless prank, perhaps a silly note that a child had slipped in there by accident. But when I unfolded it, my stomach dropped. The message was short and simple, but the words sent a chill down my spine. I'm watching you. You won't leave here. I paused for a moment, my heart racing. The note was clearly meant for me, but who would be sending something like this during a children's event? I quickly looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention, and the kids were happily playing and running around. I tucked the note into my bunny costume, thinking that maybe it was just a strange coincidence. I couldn't let it ruin my mood, so I pushed it aside and went back to my duties. But it didn't stop there. As I continued to move from one group of children to another, more notes kept appearing. Each time I reached into a basket to hide another egg or give a high five, there would be another folded note, almost always hidden beneath the plastic eggs. The messages varied, but they all carried the same sinister tone. You should have stayed away. The clock is ticking. We're coming for you. With each note, my unease grew. I tried to keep my composure, but fear was creeping in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. By now, I had to take action. The cheerful atmosphere of the event was still in full swing, and I didn't want to scare the children or their families, but I couldn't ignore the notes any longer. I discreetly made my way to the edge of the event and ducked behind a concession stand, hoping for a moment of peace to figure out what to do next. My hands were shaking as I pulled the latest note out of my costume, and I reread it over and over. You're in danger. It was becoming clear that whoever was behind this wasn't playing around. I quickly checked my phone for any messages or calls, but there was nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone with a strange sense of humor, someone who thought it would be funny to mess with the Easter Bunny. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a joke. The messages felt too deliberate, too calculated. They were meant to intimidate, and I had no idea who was behind them or why. I decided I needed help. I looked around for the event coordinator or anyone in charge, but I couldn't see anyone nearby. The park was crowded with families, and I felt isolated, unsure of who I could trust. It was then that I noticed a man standing off to the side, watching me intently. He was dressed casually, but there was something about the way he was standing that made me feel uneasy. My gut told me he was connected to whatever was happening, but I couldn't be sure. He had a cold, calculating look on his face, and for a moment, it felt like he was the one behind the notes. I needed to get out of there. The constant threat of more notes and the strange man lurking around had reached a boiling point. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but my safety was more important than finishing the job. I began to make my way toward the exit, but as I walked, I felt a hand grab my arm. I spun around, my heart pounding, but it was just another parent, smiling and thanking me for being there. They didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, and I forced a smile, nodding politely before pulling away and walking faster toward the exit. Just as I was about to reach the parking lot, I received another message, this time on my phone. It was from an unknown number. "You're not going anywhere," it read. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like a direct threat, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I wasn't sure if I should call the police, yet nothing had happened to me physically, after all, but I knew I had to do something. I decided to reach out to a friend for advice. I quickly sent a text explaining the situation, feeling the panic start to rise in my chest. "As all the authorities," she responded quickly. "You're being targeted." Her message helped calm me down a little. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. Someone was after me, and they weren't going to stop. With no more time to waste, I called the police. The operator was calm and reassuring, but I could tell she didn't fully understand the severity of the situation. After all, I was just the Easter Bunny at a community event, not someone who would normally be involved in something criminal. I explained the situation as best as I could, detailing the notes and the unsettling feeling I had about the man who seemed to be watching me. I also mentioned the threat I had received on my phone. The operator took the information seriously and assured me that an officer would be dispatched right away. By the time the officer arrived, I had moved to a nearby cafe to wait. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't sit still. When the officer finally arrived, I told him everything I had experienced, including the threatening notes and the odd behavior of the man I had seen. He asked if I had any idea who might be behind it, but I had no answers. I was just a person doing a job, and now I felt like I was being dragged into something I didn't understand. The officer listened carefully and assured me that they would investigate the situation. He also advised me to avoid returning to the event, as they would need to secure the area first. I agreed and handed over the notes and the threatening message I had received on my phone. The officer promised to follow up with me once they had more information, and I was finally able to breathe a little easier knowing I wasn't facing this alone. It took a few days for the investigation to unfold, but eventually the authorities discovered that the person behind the notes had been targeting me specifically. They had managed to track the phone number and uncovered that the man I had seen at the event was involved. It turned out that he had a history of disturbing behavior, and the police were able to connect him to several other incidents of harassment in the area. He had been trying to scare me into dropping out of the event, but thankfully, I had acted fast enough to avoid any harm. The entire ordeal left me shaken, but I was grateful that the authorities had taken it seriously and that no harm had come to me. I never expected something like this to happen while I was simply doing my job, but it reminded me of how important it is to listen to your instincts and take threats seriously. I learned that day that not all situations are as innocent as they seem, but also that when it counts, there are people who will step in to help. Story 5. I had been looking forward to the church Easter fair for weeks. It was one of those local events that always brought the whole community together with food, games, and smiling children running through bright booths and inflatable bounce houses. I thought it would be a nice break from the usual stress of the week. My kids had been buzzing with excitement all morning, asking about the egg hunt and the cotton candy. By the time we arrived, the church grounds were already filled with families and laughter. I held the hands of my younger two, while my older child ran ahead to join a group of friends near the game stalls. I kept my eyes on them as best I could while trying to keep the others entertained and calm in the crowd. It was warm but breezy, the kind of weather that made everything feel just right. The music played over the speakers, soft hymns mixed with cheerful instrumentals. I felt comfortable, even relaxed, surrounded by so many familiar faces. The event had so many things happening at once. Between the sack races, the raffle tables, and the rows of food trucks, I found myself getting distracted. Every few minutes, someone I knew from town would stop to say hello or make small talk. I answered politely, still scanning the area for my children every few seconds. I counted them in my head each time I looked, making sure everyone was accounted for. But during one of those quick greetings, something changed. I looked up from a conversation and realized that I could not see my oldest child anymore. My heart skipped. I turned full circle, eyes searching the crowd. At first, I told myself they had probably wandered just a bit too far, maybe following a group toward the petting zoo or snack area. I calmly called their name a few times, still holding the other two close. But with each passing second, panic started to replace logic. I moved quickly, pulling the younger two with me as I made my way through the crowd. I asked people nearby if they had seen a child in the clothes mine had been wearing. Some said no, others looked uncertain, and one woman said she might have seen them near the inflatable slide. I rushed there, scanning faces, looking for that one familiar expression. But they were not there. The volunteers at the slide said they had not seen anyone matching that description in a while. I tried not to cry. I could not lose control with the others depending on me. I made my way to the fair's main tent where the church staff and security volunteers were stationed. I told them what happened, giving every detail I could think of, down to the color of the shoes and the pattern on the shirt. They reacted fast, sending people out to quietly search the grounds while keeping things calm so the crowd would not panic. I clutched the hands of my younger two, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. 15 minutes passed. I felt every second of it like it was an hour. Then, one of the security volunteers radioed in that they had found a child near the far end of the parking lot behind one of the booths. I ran there as fast as I could. When I saw the child in question, I froze. It was my child, but something was wrong. Their hair had been cut, their clothes were different, and their eyes were wide with confusion. They saw me and burst into tears. I knelt and hugged them tightly, afraid to let go. I looked them over, checking for injuries or signs of struggle. They were physically unharmed, but the look in their eyes told me that something had happened. They were terrified. I asked them what they remembered, but their answers came out in shaky pieces. Someone had taken them by the hand, told them there was a surprise waiting, and led them away. They said they were taken behind one of the closed food stalls. A woman had used scissors to cut their hair and pulled a different shirt over their head. The pants they were wearing were the same, but the shirt was unfamiliar. They were told to be quiet or they would not see me again. That sentence broke something inside me. I could not imagine the fear they had felt in those moments, separated from their family and surrounded by strangers. I brought them back to the main tent where volunteers and police were now involved. They quickly blocked off the area and started reviewing the security footage from the cameras positioned around the fair. Several people came forward with statements. One teenager said they saw a woman leading a child by the hand but thought nothing of it because the child did not look distressed. Another mentioned seeing someone with scissors near the food stalls but assumed it was for packaging. The footage confirmed it. A woman had approached from the side lot, mingled into the crowd, and walked right up to my child. She bent down, spoke to them, and then calmly led them away. She disappeared behind a tent for several minutes, then emerged again holding a child with shorter hair and different clothes. That woman never returned to the fair after that. She exited the area behind the booths and vanished into the back parking lot. The police were able to get a clear image of her face from the footage. They began working on identifying her and following leads on where she might have gone. They told me this was likely a planned attempt. The change of clothes, the quick haircut, and the exit strategy all pointed to something premeditated. They believed the goal was to make the child harder to recognize before getting too far. If more time had passed, it could have ended much differently. For the rest of that day, I did not let go of any of my children. The fair continued around us, but for me, the joy had drained out of it completely. I sat with the police, answering questions, filling out forms, and trying to comfort my child. I kept thinking about what could have happened if those volunteers had not acted so quickly, or if no one had noticed in time. The thought haunted me, even after we left the church grounds and went home. In the days that followed, the community came together in a way I had not seen before. Flyers were posted, messages were shared online. A description of the woman was distributed to every local business, school, and neighborhood watch group. People started taking more precautions at community events, where background checks for volunteers were updated, and new safety rules were put in place for all family events hosted by the church. Eventually, the woman was identified through a combination of the footage and community tips. She had a history of mental health issues, and had previously been reported for following children at playgrounds. The authorities located her several towns away. When they arrested her, she was found with more clothing, scissors, and photos of children at public events. She was taken into custody, and the case moved into the hands of legal professionals. Knowing she was caught did not erase the fear, but it gave me peace. My child was safe, my family was whole, and the experience, while terrifying, taught me just how quickly things can happen and how important it is to stay vigilant. I never imagined that a fun Easter outing could turn into something so terrifying, but I was thankful for how it ended. It could have been a tragedy, but instead it was a reminder to never take safety for granted. Story 6. I wanted to do something thoughtful this Easter. Life had been hectic, and I barely had time to connect with people lately, so I thought ordering custom Easter gift baskets online would be a sweet gesture. The website I found offered personalized options with candy, trinkets, and messages. It looked legitimate, had decent reviews, and the ordering process was straightforward. I selected a few designs and even uploaded a photo for one of the customized cards to make it feel more personal. The baskets arrived a few days before Easter. I received 5 of them, all neatly wrapped with pastel ribbons and cheerful packaging. 4 of the baskets looked exactly like the ones I ordered, each labeled with the name of the intended recipient and a printed message I had typed in during checkout. The 5th basket was unmarked. At first, I assumed it was a bonus item or a mistake from the company. It was slightly heavier than the others and wrapped in a darker cellophane that seemed out of place among the pastel colors. I opened it last, curious to see what it contained. Inside were candies, but something looked wrong. A few of the wrappers had a dark, sticky substance smeared across them. At first, I thought it might have melted chocolate or maybe syrup from a leaking candy. But when I touched it, the color and consistency were off. My stomach turned as I brought the wrapper closer and noticed the unmistakable deep red tint. It looked like dried blood. Beneath the pile of candy was a small photograph. It was partially burned along the edges, and it took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was a photo of me, sitting on my front porch from what looked like just a few weeks ago. My heart started pounding as I stared at the image. Someone had taken this without my knowledge. The idea that someone had not only watched me but had been close enough to capture this photo made my skin crawl. I backed away from the basket, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct told me this was not a sick joke or some packaging accident. I checked the return label, but there was no identifying information other than the company's standard sticker. I grabbed my laptop and searched the website again, but this time it gave me an error message. The page was no longer available. I tried refreshing, typing in the exact URL, even searching for reviews again, but everything was gone. The baskets had come through a shipping service, so I contacted them next. The representative on the phone said they would investigate the origin of the delivery, but they needed more time. I offered to send them photos of the basket and the contents, and they promised to escalate the report. I felt a small sense of relief knowing I was doing something, but it did not stop the creeping fear that someone had gone to great lengths to reach me in a deeply disturbing way. That night, I could not sleep. Every sound made me jump, and I checked each window twice to make sure they were locked. I kept thinking about the photo, wondering how close that person had been. I tried convincing myself that maybe it was a prank or a mistake, that someone else had meant to receive the basket. But the burned photo erased any doubt. Whoever sent that wanted me to see it and feel watched, violated. The next morning, I decided to take the basket and its contents to the police. The officer on duty took one look at the candy in the photo and called another officer to the desk. They asked me a few questions and filled out a report. They said they would collect the evidence and try to track the sender through the shipping information. I asked if I should be concerned for my safety. They were honest. They said it could be a prank, but they would treat it seriously given the nature of the contents. I installed new locks and a few security cameras around the house later that afternoon. I checked my online presence, adjusted my privacy settings, and deleted a few posts that revealed too much about my location. I started feeling paranoid about everything, like someone might be watching even through my phone or laptop. I kept checking the live feed from my front door camera every hour. For the next couple of days, nothing unusual happened, and I slowly tried to return to normal. Then on Easter morning, I found something else. A small envelope had been slipped under my front door sometime during the night. It was plain, with no name or markings on the outside. Inside was another photograph, this time of me standing in my kitchen holding one of the Easter baskets. The photo had clearly been taken from outside through a window. My legs almost gave out from under me as I stared at the image. I had locked everything. I had curtains closed. Still, someone had been close enough to take that shot without me noticing. I called the police again and handed over the new evidence. They reviewed the security footage, but the person had somehow avoided every camera angle. They reassured me they were working on identifying the sender. I asked if they had any leads, and they said nothing definitive yet. The detective handling my case suggested I consider staying somewhere else temporarily. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend for a few days, unable to shake the feeling of being hunted. During that time, I kept thinking about the website. I began to suspect it was created for the sole purpose of reaching me. I remembered uploading my photo for one of the card inserts and realized that might have been the way they got access to more recent images. My social media had been locked down since, but there were still ways someone could have been following me for longer than I realized. The idea that someone had been watching me and planned this delivery with such precision haunted me. A week passed, and then another, and slowly the trail went cold. The messages stopped, no more packages arrived, and the police said they were still investigating but had found no new leads. I returned home, still wary but slightly more at ease. I continued checking my cameras and made sure never to leave any windows uncovered. Life went on, and though the fear never fully disappeared, it faded with time. Months later, I received a call from the officer assigned to my case. They had found a suspect, someone who had been involved in a series of similar incidents across different cities. They matched some details from the packaging and shipping method to an earlier case. The suspect had finally been caught breaking into another residence and was being held. While they could not confirm with absolute certainty that the basket had come from this person, they believed it was highly likely. But that news lifted a weight I did not realize I had been carrying for so long. I was cautious even after that, still keeping my security system active and my personal information private. But over time, I regained peace of mind. I started enjoying holidays again, though I now avoided personalized gifts that involved my image. The horror that Easter had changed something in me, but it also taught me to take better care of my digital footprint and personal safety. I never found out the motive behind it all, but I no longer needed to. Knowing that the person was caught and I could live without fear was enough. I found strength in surviving something terrifying and moving forward anyway. Story 7. The Easter parade had always been one of the highlights of spring for our town. I decided to take my toddler this year since the weather was perfect and the streets were already lined with decorations. Children were running around in pastel outfits. The air was filled with the smell of cotton candy, and the sound of cheerful music echoed through the streets. It felt like the kind of day every parent hoped for, full of laughter, sunshine, and simple joy. My toddler clapped along with the beat of the parade, eyes wide with excitement. I found a good spot near the sidewalk where we could see everything clearly. My toddler sat on my lap at first, then ran forward just a bit to get a better view of the floats and dancers. A few people took pictures, which was expected at a public event like this. But one person caught my eye. He was standing a little too close, holding a large camera, and seemed focused on my child in particular. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. He could have been a local photographer or just someone enjoying the parade. Still, the way he kept aiming his lens in our direction started to make me uncomfortable. I moved slightly to block his view, hoping he would get the message. But instead, he shifted position too, as if trying to regain a clear shot. I picked up my toddler and stood up, walking further down the sidewalk to get away from the man. I thought that would be enough to end it. We joined a group of families gathered near a candy booth, and for a few minutes everything felt normal again. I handed my child a small bag of jelly beans and tried to relax. But when I turned to glance over my shoulder, he was there again. He was not being subtle about it either. His camera was pointed straight at us, and he did not even pretend to be taking pictures of the parade anymore. I stepped in front of my toddler and stared directly at him. He lowered his camera briefly, then turned and walked into the crowd. I felt a mix of relief and unease, hoping that was the end of it, but unable to shake the discomfort. The parade continued, and I tried to focus on my child's excitement. There were dancers in bunny costumes, marching bands, and colorful floats. My toddler squealed with delight and waved at everything that passed. I smiled and nodded at other parents around me, all of us sharing the joy of the moment. Still, I kept scanning the crowd, never quite letting my guard down. When the parade ended, we started the short walk home. My toddler was tired but happy, munching on candy and clutching a small balloon shaped like an egg. We passed familiar houses and well-kept gardens, moving through streets that usually made me feel safe. But today, the sense of safety was gone. Something felt off. Halfway home, I heard footsteps behind us. I looked back quickly and saw the same man from the parade, a block away but walking in the same direction. My heart sank. I picked up my toddler and quickened my pace. It was possible he lived nearby, but the way he kept his eyes on us made me doubt that. I took a different route than usual, one that looped around the neighborhood in a longer circle. It was something I had done before when the stroller felt too cramped and I wanted a bit more time outside. I hoped this time it would help me figure out if we were actually being followed. At each turn, I glanced back, and each time he was still there. Panic started to build inside me. I reached into my bag and grabbed my phone, keeping it in my hand as I walked faster. My toddler clung to me, sleepy and unaware of the growing fear behind my calm expression. I whispered softly to comfort them while scanning the street for anyone else who might help. But the sidewalks had emptied, and the houses were quiet. I turned again, this time toward a busy intersection. There was a small gas station nearby, and I headed straight for it. I figured it was better to be near people and security cameras than to head home with someone tailing us. As I stepped into the parking lot, I looked behind me. The man paused at the corner, then crossed the street in the opposite direction. It was enough to make me pause. Maybe he really had been walking that way by coincidence. Maybe he had lost interest. But I waited at the gas station for a while longer, buying a bottle of water and pretending to browse the snack aisle while keeping one eye on the windows. I saw no sign of him after that. When I finally felt confident he was gone, I took a longer, winding path home. My toddler had fallen asleep in my arms and my muscles ached, but I was too tense to care. I checked behind me every few steps. The sense of violation clung to me, the idea that someone had taken interest in us without permission, that they had followed us from a parade meant for children. When we got home, I locked the door behind me and double-checked every window. I placed my toddler in their crib and sat down with my phone. I called the local police department and reported what had happened. They took the information seriously, even though there was not much they could do without a clear threat or evidence. They recommended keeping an eye out and calling 911 immediately if I saw him again. I also contacted the organizers of the Easter parade and shared my concerns. They thanked me and said they would review any event footage and check with hired photographers to see if anyone unusual had been seen with a camera. I shared a brief description of the man, hoping it might help prevent him from doing the same thing to someone else. For days afterward, I remained on edge. Every time I took my toddler outside, I watched the street carefully. I checked my doorbell camera often and added another one facing the backyard. I even spoke to some of my neighbors, letting them know what happened in case they saw anyone suspicious. It felt like my peaceful world had shifted slightly. But over time, the fear began to fade. The man never reappeared. I continued to take my toddler on walks, though I stayed close to busier streets and brought someone with me when I could. I made it a habit to look around more, to stay alert but not paralyzed. The parade incident became a warning that changed how I viewed safety in public. I still took my toddler to community events, but I kept a firmer grip on them and a closer eye on the crate, on the people around us. I taught myself to trust my instincts and act on them instead of brushing them aside. That one day taught me how quickly something joyful could become unsettling, and how important it was to stay prepared. Even though it ended without harm, I never forgot the feeling of being watched and followed. The biggest change was the way I carried myself from then on. I refused to let fear control my life, but I also refused to ignore what had happened. I installed more security measures at home, updated my emergency contacts, and talked openly with others about the experience. It made me more cautious, but also more confident in my ability to protect my family. That day at the Easter parade began with laughter, nearly ended in fear, but in the end I reclaimed the peace that was almost stolen. I remained vigilant, not paranoid. I refused to let a stranger ruin something special between me and my child. And most importantly, I learned that protecting someone did not always mean fighting back. Sometimes it meant noticing, acting quickly, and never ignoring that gut feeling that tells you something is wrong. Story 8. The Easter egg run was supposed to be a lighthearted event. It was a local community tradition, one I had heard about for years, but never got the chance to join until now. I liked the idea of mixing a trail run with a bit of holiday fun, the added twist of searching for hidden eggs giving a sense of adventure to the course. The weather was perfect that morning, the sun shining gently through the trees, the air crisp and clean. Everything felt peaceful and inviting as the group gathered near the start line. Most of the participants were families with children or couples laughing as they stretched and prepared for the run. I went alone, wanting a bit of solitude and the chance to enjoy nature without distractions. The course was a winding trail through a wooded park, with colorful flags and signs pointing the way towards scattered egg checkpoints. There were prizes inside some of the eggs, so people moved eagerly from one to the next. I kept a moderate pace, more interested in the experience than winning anything. Half an hour in, the crowd had thinned out around me. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter everything became. I liked the silence, broken only by the occasional bird call or crunch of twigs underfoot. I spotted a few eggs along the path, tucked under logs or nestled in the roots of trees. It was relaxing, the kind of event that made me feel calm and distant from the usual stress of life. The trail curved sharply to the left, and the markers led me off the main path for a bit. That is when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just some debris, maybe a costume someone had dropped, but something about it made me pause. I walked toward it slowly, my instincts telling me this was not part of the game. As I got closer, I saw that it was a person. They were slumped against a tree, tied up with thick rope that dug into their wrists and ankles. Their face was dirty and bruised, their clothes torn. I froze, my heart thudding so loud it echoed in my ears. The person opened their eyes slightly and looked at me, barely able to speak, but their eyes said enough. I dropped to my knees beside them, trying to assess the situation while panic bubbled inside me. Their mouth was gagged with a strip of cloth, and their arms were pinned tightly behind their back. I fumbled to untie the knots, my fingers shaking. It took me longer than it should have to remove the gag. As soon as it came loose, they whispered something, but their voice was too weak to understand. I could tell they were scared, exhausted, and in pain. I looked around, expecting someone else to come running, maybe the organizers, maybe another runner, but the woods were silent. My phone had signal, thankfully, and I called for help. I tried to stay calm as I explained what I found, giving them the nearest marker I had seen and describing the area. They told me to stay with the person and assured me someone would arrive soon. I stayed by their side, offering water and trying to keep them awake. They began to speak a little clearer, explaining that they had been taken the night before and had no idea how they got there. I asked if they knew who had done this, but they just shook their head. They remembered being grabbed, something sharp against their back, and then nothing until they woke up tied to the tree. I felt sick listening, knowing someone had done this deliberately and left them to be found by accident. If I had not strayed off the path a bit, they might have stayed there even longer. After what felt like forever, I heard voices in the distance. I stood up and waved, calling out. 2 emergency responders rushed toward us, followed by others not far behind. They immediately began treating the person and asking me questions. I explained everything I could, still trying to process what I had stumbled into. One of them asked if I had touched anything else, and I said no, just the ropes and the gag. The responders thanked me for calling it in and for staying with the person. They radioed in updates and carried the person out on a stretcher. I followed slowly, still in a daze. The trail felt darker now, as if the trees were watching me. What was supposed to be a cheerful community event had turned into something I would never forget. I could not believe what I had seen. Back at the starting area, the event had continued as if nothing had happened. Kids ran around with baskets, parents chatted near the snack tables, and music played from a speaker near the registration tent. I approached one of the organizers and told them what happened. They looked stunned and asked for more details. I gave them what I knew, and they thanked me, promising to speak to the authorities as soon as they arrived. Later that day, I got a call from someone involved in the investigation. They confirmed that the person I had found was recovering in the hospital. They had not yet identified the person who left them in the woods, but they were hopeful about gathering evidence. Apparently, the location was not random. There had been reports of strange activity in that part of the woods before, but nothing had ever been proven. My discovery had changed that. Look, the next few days were filled with questions and interviews. I had to recount the event multiple times for the police and answer follow-up questions as they uncovered more information. The local news picked up the story, and it spread fast. I kept my name out of it, preferring to stay anonymous. I just wanted to help without becoming part of the attention. Eventually, they caught the person responsible. It turned out to be someone who lived not far from the park, someone with a long history of trouble but never anything this serious. They found evidence in their home that linked them directly to the crime, including items matching those used to restrain the person in the woods. Knowing they were behind bars brought a strange sense of relief. I kept thinking about how different things could have turned out if I had not wandered slightly off the trail. If I had run past that area or ignored the strange shape in the trees, that person might still be out there. It made me more aware of how easily life can change in a moment. What started as a simple community event became something far more serious. I continued volunteering for events after that, but with a different mindset. I paid closer attention to my surroundings, trusted my instincts more, and never took silence for granted. The person I helped recovered well and even reached out through the authorities to thank me. I never needed anything from them in return, but hearing they were doing better made all the fear and confusion worth it. Even now, when I return to that trail, I remember what happened. I remember the weight of that moment, the shock of finding someone in such a desperate situation, and the overwhelming need to help. It reminded me how important it is to act when something feels wrong, no matter how small. That day could have ended so differently, but because I followed a gut feeling, it ended in rescue instead of tragedy. Story 9. I volunteered to help plan the neighborhood Easter party because it felt like the right way to give back to the community. The idea of bringing families together with games, food, and fun made the long hours of organizing worth it. I worked with a few other volunteers to set up decorations, gather supplies, and plan the schedule for the event. There was something refreshing about being around people who genuinely wanted to create something joyful. It felt like a safe, wholesome place where everyone could relax. We spent weeks preparing. From coordinating egg hunts to finding someone to dress up as the Easter Bunny, every detail had to be handled. I spent most of my free time after work reviewing checklists and reaching out to local vendors. Neighbors donated supplies, others pitched in with snacks and drinks, and a few even offered to help with setup and cleanup. It brought the neighborhood together in a way I had not seen in years. Everyone was excited, especially the kids. On the morning of the event, the energy was electric. We arrived early to start setting up the park area where the party would take place. Tables, tents, and colorful streamers were put in place as volunteers worked side by side. But parents arrived with their children, dressed in spring colors, holding baskets and wide smiles. The weather was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze, and it looked like the day was going to go off without a hitch. I was stationed near the entrance to greet guests and hand out maps of the different activity areas. People came in groups, excited for the games, face painting, and food. A few introduced themselves, and I made mental notes of faces I hadn't seen before. That part of the job was always nice, getting to welcome new neighbors and make them feel included. Everyone seemed friendly, polite, and genuinely happy to be there. About halfway through the day, someone came up to the table where I was helping hand out raffle tickets. He introduced himself with a calm voice and a warm smile. He said he had just moved into the area and had heard about the party through a neighbor. I offered him a ticket and told him where he could find the egg hunt and snacks. He thanked me and joined a group of people nearby, blending in as though he had always been part of the community. Later, I noticed him chatting with a few families. He was friendly, asking questions, offering to take photos for people, and laughing along with others. Something about his energy felt rehearsed. His politeness was almost too smooth, and I caught him watching the children a little too intently. It was not enough to raise a full alarm, but it was enough to make me keep an eye on him. Sometimes instinct whispers when logic stays silent. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself watching him in short glances, always expecting him to do something out of place. He never acted inappropriately, but his eagerness to mingle and his almost exaggerated cheerfulness made me uneasy. He stayed close to the game areas where the children were playing and seemed to always be helping someone, which should have been a good thing, but something still felt off. I convinced myself that I was overthinking it. After all, he hadn't actually done anything wrong. Just before the raffle drawing began, one of the other volunteers pulled me aside. She was whispering fast and looked shaken. She told me someone recognized the new guy from a news report several years ago. According to her, he looked exactly like a man who had been convicted of abusing minors and had been released not long ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. We needed to be sure, but we could not risk ignoring it. We stepped away and quietly looked up some public databases using our phones. It took only a few minutes before we found a match. The man in the park used a different name, but the face was unmistakable. The photo on the registry, although older, was clearly him. The crime listed was horrifying, and it made my skin crawl to think he had been walking among the families, chatting with kids, laughing with parents. I felt sick with guilt for having welcomed him so easily. We alerted the lead organizer, who immediately called the non-emergency police line and asked for assistance without causing a scene. We didn't want to scare the children or alert the man that we had found him out. While we waited, I watched him closely. He was now sitting near the egg decorating table, casually laughing and handing out markers. It was difficult to believe someone so calm and helpful could be hiding such a dark past. When the officers arrived, they came in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. They quietly approached him and asked if they could speak with him away from the group. He stood up, clearly surprised but still composed. They walked him to the edge of the park, and soon after, 2 uniformed officers showed up and took him into custody. Parents began to whisper, wondering what had happened. We did our best to keep the event going, trying to shield the kids from the truth. After he was taken away, one of the officers returned to speak with us. He confirmed that the man had violated his parole by using a false identity and attending a public event without registering his presence in the area. He had been living under an alias, avoiding the systems that were designed to track his movements. Thankfully, nothing bad had happened that day, but knowing how close we came to a possible tragedy left a weight in my chest. We had all been lucky. We gathered the rest of the volunteers and told them the truth after most guests had gone home. Everyone felt shaken, but we were relieved to know we had acted in time. The parents who learned what happened were grateful and promised to stay vigilant in the future. We decided to establish better check-ins and safety measures for future community events, including background checks for anyone who wanted to volunteer. It was not something we had considered before, but now it seemed necessary. That night, I sat at home and tried to process everything. I felt proud that we had responded quickly and quietly without causing a panic, but I also felt angry that someone like him had almost slipped through unnoticed. It reminded me that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it comes with a smile and a handshake. But I also reminded myself that paying attention, trusting your instincts, and working together with others could make all the difference. The next week, we held a follow-up meeting with the community to talk about what had happened. It was a quiet but necessary conversation. People asked questions, shared their thoughts, and listened as we explained the steps we were taking to protect everyone moving forward. It turned out that the sense of unity in the neighborhood had not been damaged. In fact, it had grown stronger. People became more aware, more protective, and more willing to look out for each other. The Easter party, despite the dark shadow that had briefly touched it, was remembered for the joy it brought to the children and the way our community responded with strength and care. It taught me how important it is to stay alert, to act when something feels wrong, and to never assume a smiling face means safety. I still help with organizing local events, but now with new protocols and a sharper eye. What could have been a tragedy became a turning point, and I am grateful we caught it in time. Story 10. I found the envelope in my mailbox on Easter morning, tucked between a grocery flyer and a credit card offer. It was bright and cheery, covered in cartoon bunnies and pastel eggs, with no return address and my name written neatly in blue ink. I assumed it was from a neighbor, or maybe someone from work trying to be thoughtful. I smiled as I walked back into the house, still half asleep, and clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I opened the envelope without thinking twice. The card itself looked like something from a supermarket shelf. Inside were glittery words wishing me a joyful Easter and a year full of blessings. But beneath that message, loose photographs slipped out and scattered across the table. My heart skipped as I reached for them. One by one, I flipped them over, and with each image, the pit in my stomach grew. They were pictures of me asleep in bed, taken from different angles, each one disturbingly clear. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a prank. Maybe someone photoshopped them. Maybe it was some strange joke I did not understand. But the angles were too precise, the lighting too consistent with the lamp on my nightstand. One photo was unmistakably recent, judging by the pajamas I had just worn earlier that week. I scanned the background of the images, searching for clues. Then I saw it, the reflection of a shadow in the mirror on the dresser. I dropped the photos on the table and stepped back like they might burn me. My breathing quickened, and I glanced toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. Nothing looked out of place, but that only made me more uneasy. Someone had been inside my house. They had stood there, camera in hand, while I slept completely unaware. I felt exposed, violated, and suddenly unsafe in the one place that was supposed to protect me. I checked every door and window in the house, even though I had locked them all the night before. Everything was still secured. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, nothing missing. That only made the situation more terrifying. Whoever had taken those photos had done it without leaving a trace. I called the police immediately and waited by the door, pacing, heart pounding with each creak of the floorboards. When the officers arrived, I handed over the envelope and the photos. They took my statement and walked through the house, checking each room while asking questions I had no answers to. Had I noticed anything unusual recently? Had anyone new entered my life? I told them no. I lived a quiet life, kept to myself, and barely interacted with anyone outside of work. They promised to investigate and suggested I install security cameras as soon as possible. That night, I could not bring myself to sleep in my bedroom. I set up a sleeping bag in the living room, every light on, a kitchen knife close at hand. I kept my phone unlocked in case I needed to call again. My mind kept replaying the thought of someone standing over me while I slept. Each creak of the house, each gust of wind felt like a threat. I barely slept, and when I did, it was in short bursts filled with nightmares. The next morning, I bought a full set of cameras and spent the day installing them in every corner of the house. Inside and out, nothing would go unseen. I upgraded the locks on my doors, added motion detectors, and even replaced the blinds with blackout curtains. My home felt like a fortress, but I still felt no safer. The idea that someone had already breached it once stayed with me constantly. The days passed without another incident, but I remained on edge. I jumped at small noises, second-guessed every shadow, and checked the camera feeds obsessively. I called the police station every other day, asking if there had been any progress. They had nothing. No fingerprints on the card, no known threats, no recent break-ins in the area. It felt like whoever did this had simply disappeared. Then a week later, another envelope arrived. This one was plain and unmarked, slid directly under my front door. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside were more photos, this time of me sitting on the couch watching television, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and doing dishes in the kitchen. All recent, all taken from inside the house. I rushed to my security system to check the footage, but nothing was there. No intruder, no sign of entry, no movement at all. I could not understand how it was possible, or every angle had been covered. I called the company that installed the system and demanded an inspection. They confirmed the equipment was fully functional and the footage had not been tampered with. The only conclusion left was chilling. Someone was inside the house long before I installed the cameras. Someone had been watching me for longer than I thought. I took time off work and stayed at a hotel for several days. I needed to get away, to clear my head and try to make sense of what was happening. I spoke with the police again, and they expanded their investigation, treating it as a stalking case now. But I knew that without more evidence, they could only do so much. I kept looking over my shoulder wherever I went. I watched every person I passed on the street, wondering if one of them had been the one behind the camera. One evening at the hotel, I received a call from the detective assigned to the case. They had identified someone in connection to another break-in across town. That person had been caught with several stolen items, including photographs and personal belongings from other victims. When shown one of the photos from the Easter card, they confirmed it had come from the same source. The man had been targeting people at random, breaking in while they slept, taking photos, then mailing them as trophies. They found my spare key hidden under a garden rock and believed that was how he gained access to the house in the beginning. He had managed to copy it when I had a delivery scheduled weeks before Easter. The idea that it had started so simply, that he had walked in like he belonged there, made my skin crawl. He was caught, and though it did not erase the fear, it gave me a sense of closure. He would face charges, and I would not be his victim again. After he was arrested, I returned home and immediately changed all the locks, reinforced the doors, and got rid of every hiding spot outside. It took time, but I began to feel like I was reclaiming my life. Sleep came a little easier. The nightmares faded, and I slowly started trusting my space again. I stayed in touch with the other victims, finding comfort in knowing I was not alone. We shared our stories, helped each other heal, and found strength in survival. Now, every holiday that comes around, I still feel a brief moment of unease. I still double-check the locks, still glance at the mailbox with a bit of caution. But I refuse to let fear take over again. I took my life back, piece by piece, and made my home feel safe once more. The memory of that Easter morning will never fully leave me, but I have learned how to live beyond it. Story 11. It was early on Easter morning when I set out for the sunrise service. I had woken up earlier than usual, feeling the need to witness the beauty of a new day. The air was still chilly, a reminder that winter had only recently loosened its grip on the world. I drove along the empty road, my headlights cutting through the darkness, the calmness of the early hours settling over me like a soft blanket. It felt peaceful, and I thought it was going to be just another quiet drive to the service, but everything changed when I saw the car. The car was parked on the side of the road, its driver's door wide open. It wasn't a place where you'd typically pull over unless something was wrong. I slowed down, my mind immediately wondering what had happened. There were no other cars around, and the eerie stillness of the scene struck me. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what I should do. It was strange. The door was open, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I turned off the engine and got out of the car, scanning the area to see if there were any signs of life. The morning air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I approached the car cautiously, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. The inside of the car looked perfectly normal, as if whoever had been there had simply stepped out and left. The keys were in the ignition, the engine off, and there was no sign of a struggle or anything out of place. I couldn't help but feel a knot form in my stomach. Why would someone leave their car like this, especially with the door wide open? I walked around the car slowly, looking into the empty passenger seat in the back. There were no personal belongings scattered about, no bags or objects that might indicate someone had been in a rush. It was as if the car had been abandoned without any explanation. My heart began to beat faster, and a sense of unease settled over me. It didn't make any sense. Why would anyone leave a car on the side of the road with the door left wide open and just walk away? I decided to look further, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. There was a small dirt path off the road, partially hidden by the trees. My first instinct was to call for help, but something told me I needed to check first. Maybe the person had just stepped off the road for a moment. Maybe it was all a simple misunderstanding. I walked cautiously toward the path, keeping my senses sharp. The early morning light began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The path was narrow, lined with overgrown grass and small branches. I walked slowly, unsure of what I was hoping to find. Every step I took felt heavier, the silence around me almost oppressive. I called out softly, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The only response was the rustling of the leaves. I stopped, listening intently, but all I could hear was the wind. I took a deep breath and continued, the path twisting further into the woods. As I ventured deeper, my thoughts raced. Could something have happened to the person? Was there an accident that led them to leave their car behind? Or was this something more sinister? My imagination was working overtime, feeding me with all sorts of theories, none of which seemed plausible. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I forced myself to keep moving. The path led to a small clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. The trees around the area looked old, their branches thick and twisted, making the clearing feel darker than it should have been. I stood there for a moment, looking around. The whole scene felt off, like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. It didn't help that the sun had not fully risen yet, and the remaining darkness clung to the edges of the forest, making everything feel even more mysterious. I turned back, deciding that it was best to return to the car and call for help. As I retraced my steps, I kept my eyes peeled for anything unusual. The silence around me was almost suffocating, and my mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of reach, something I should have noticed. When I reached the road again, I paused to take in my surroundings. The car was still there, the door still wide open, but now I noticed something I hadn't before: a faint trail of footprints leading off the road. The footprints were small, almost delicate, as if someone had been walking barefoot. They led into the grass, heading toward the woods. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Someone had definitely left the car, but now it seemed they were walking further into the forest. I wasn't sure what to do, but the logical part of me told me to call 911. But the part of me that was still trying to make sense of the situation wanted to find out more first. With a renewed sense of purpose, I followed the trail of footprints. The more I walked, the more I began to question everything. What had happened to this person? Why had they left their car behind? The path became more difficult to follow as the ground grew uneven, the grass taller, and the woods denser. I could no longer hear the sounds of the road or the world outside this small corner of the forest. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I finally came to a stop. Ahead of me, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, was a person. At first, I thought they were just another figure in the shadows, but as I approached, I realized that they were real. The person stood still, staring ahead, their back to me. I couldn't tell if they had heard me or if they were just lost in thought. I called out softly, unsure if I should approach them. "Are you okay?" I asked. The person didn't respond, but I could see their shoulders rise and fall with shallow breaths. They were alive, but something wasn't right. There was a sense of something broken, something lost. Slowly, I took another step forward, my voice trembling slightly. "Do you need help?" The figure finally turned around, and I gasped. Their eyes were wide, unfocused, and hollow, like they had been caught in a trance. For a moment, I wasn't sure if they recognized me or if they were even aware of where they were. Their expression was vacant, and they seemed to stare right through me. I stepped back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "Are you okay?" I repeated, my voice more insistent now. The person blinked slowly, as if trying to come back to reality. Finally, they spoke, their voice hoarse and strained. "I don't remember how I got here." The words were soft, almost like they had forgotten how to speak. I could feel my heart race, but I knew I couldn't leave them alone like this. They were confused, disoriented, and frightened, and I couldn't just walk away. I led the person back to the car, where I called for help. By the time the authorities arrived, the sun had fully risen, and the world had started to wake up. The officers took over, guiding the person into their car and checking on them. I stayed behind, watching, unsure of what to do next. The situation still didn't make sense to me, but at least the person was no longer alone. As I watched them drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something I hadn't yet uncovered. As the sun began to warm the earth, I finally made my way to the sunrise service. The church was just a short drive away, and the sky was filled with the colors of dawn. It felt like a new beginning, a moment of hope amidst the confusion. Even though the morning had been strange and unsettling, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that the person would be all right. There was still so much I didn't understand, but for now that would have to be enough. The rest would come in time. Story 12. I had never been to an Easter market before, so I was excited to experience the bustling atmosphere, the colorful stalls, and the warm spring air. It was the perfect day to spend time with my child as the sun was shining and the scent of fresh flowers and candy filled the air. My toddler was in a stroller, happily munching on a small snack while I pushed the stroller through the crowded market. There were families everywhere, laughing and talking, the sounds of music drifting from one of the nearby stages. I felt safe, in a way, surrounded by so many people, but little did I know that something would soon happen that would shake my sense of security. We had just passed a stand selling handmade Easter decorations when I noticed a woman standing near the stroller. She was well dressed, her clothes neat and clean, and her demeanor calm. At first I didn't think much of it. She looked like one of the many shoppers at the market. But then she smiled at my child, and I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It wasn't a normal smile, not one you'd expect from a stranger admiring a child. It was more like a smile that was too familiar, too knowing. I tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. I turned away to examine some of the crafts on display, but my intuition kept nagging at me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman step closer to the stroller. She seemed to be leaning in to talk to my child, and although I couldn't hear what she was saying, it didn't look like she was trying to offer a friendly greeting. My heart began to race as I instinctively took a step closer to the stroller, but before I could say anything, the woman spoke. "Sweetheart, it's time to go home. Your mom is waiting for you," she said softly, her voice almost too smooth, too convincing. I froze, my body instantly tense. Something about her words didn't sit right with me. I knew immediately that something was off. There was no way this woman could have known my child, and even if she did, she shouldn't have been talking to my toddler like that. My mind raced, and the world around me seemed to slow down. I quickly moved in front of the stroller, blocking her view of my child, and met her gaze. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The woman hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering, but then she recovered, still speaking in that unnervingly calm tone. "I'm a relative, sweetie. I was just coming to pick up your little one. Don't you remember me?" I shook my head, my gut telling me that something was terribly wrong. No relative of mine would act this way, let alone approach my child in a public space like this. My toddler, oblivious to the tension, simply looked at the woman curiously, unaware of the danger. I moved to the side, carefully blocking the woman's access to my child. The busy market seemed to be oblivious to what was unfolding. People were walking by, chatting, laughing, going about their business. I couldn't help but feel a wave of panic rising in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but you are mistaken," I said, trying to maintain control. "My child doesn't know you. Please leave." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile never fading. "It's okay. I'm here to help. Let's get you out of here. Your mom will be so happy to see you." I felt a surge of anger, mixed with fear. There was no way I was going to let this stranger take my child, no matter how convincing her words sounded. I scanned the area quickly, looking for any sign of a friend or family member who might have been with her, but there was no one nearby. My toddler began to fidget in the stroller, and I immediately reached down to reassure him, touching his tiny hand, trying to calm both him and myself. "Who are you really?" I asked again, this time my voice sharper, demanding an answer. My eyes were locked on hers, and I could see a flicker of hesitation in her expression. It was a small moment, but enough to tell me that I had hit a nerve. The woman took a step back, her calm demeanor slipping slightly. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath. "I was just trying to help." Before I could react, she turned and started to walk away quickly. I was frozen for a moment, unsure whether to follow or stay with my child. But then my instincts kicked in, and I knew I couldn't let her slip away. I quickly pulled out my phone and dialed the emergency number, feeling a sense of urgency as the call connected. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator asked, her voice calm but professional. I took a deep breath. I'm at the Easter market, and a woman just tried to take my child. She pretended to be a relative, and I don't know who she is. Please send someone immediately. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but I wasn't about to sit around and wait. I kept my eyes on the woman, who was now walking away at a brisk pace. I didn't know if she had an accomplice or if she was acting alone, but I wasn't about to let her get away with whatever she had planned. I grabbed my child's stroller and started to move toward the exit of the market, all the while keeping my eyes fixed on the woman. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if I hadn't been paying attention. My child, still oblivious, was humming happily, unaware of the danger that had just passed so close. As I reached the exit, I spotted a security guard standing near the gates. I hurried toward him, feeling a slight sense of relief wash over me. "That woman," I said urgently, pointing toward the woman in the distance. "She tried to take my child. Please stop her." The guard immediately sprang into action, calling for backup over his radio. Within moments, several other guards were at the gates, and I could see that they were approaching the woman. She was still walking away, but now she seemed to sense the increased attention. She slowed down, looking over her shoulder, but it was too late. The guards were on her in an instant, and one of them approached her, speaking to her in a firm, commanding tone. I stayed by the exit, watching the scene unfold. The woman was now being detained, her earlier calm demeanor completely shattered. She was speaking rapidly, but I couldn't make out her words from where I stood. It didn't matter. I had my child, and that was all that mattered. Within moments, a police officer arrived, and I gave him a brief description of the woman and what had happened. He assured me that the situation was being handled and that the woman would be taken into custody for questioning. My hands were still shaking as I held my child close, but I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare had been averted. The officer asked if I wanted to file a report, but I declined, feeling grateful that everything had ended safely, that I didn't need to relive the fear and anxiety of the past few minutes. All I wanted was to get my child home, where we could be safe and away from the chaos. As I walked away from the market, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, still uneasy, but knowing that I had done the right thing. I had listened to my instincts, stayed calm, and protected my child. That was the most important thing. The market might have been full of joy and celebration, but I had learned a valuable lesson that day. Never let your guard down, no matter how familiar or safe a situation might seem. Story 13. I was invited to an Easter dinner, and at first, everything seemed normal. The table was beautifully set, with delicate spring flowers in the center, and the scent of roasting lamb filled the air. People were chatting, laughing, and exchanging stories, creating a warm atmosphere that made me feel at ease. The host, a kind person who had invited me over several times in the past, seemed to be in high spirits, moving around the room, making sure everyone was comfortable. It felt like the perfect holiday gathering, one I had been looking forward to for weeks. However, as the evening wore on, I started noticing something odd. There were moments where the laughter seemed a little too forced, the conversations a little too rehearsed. People would look at each other strangely before quickly changing the topic. It was subtle at first, something you might miss if you weren't paying close attention, but as I continued to observe, I realized that something wasn't quite right. The energy in the room had shifted, though no one seemed to acknowledge it. Around the time dessert was served, the host stood up, clinking their glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted instantly, all eyes turning to them, expecting a toast or perhaps a warm speech to mark the occasion. Instead, what they said sent a chill down my spine. "I hope you all enjoy your meal, but before we continue I need to show you something," the host said, with a grin that didn't reach their eyes. A few guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was coming next. Without warning, the host walked to the front door and locked it, making sure to turn the key with a deliberate click. The sudden sound of the lock echoed through the room, sending a wave of unease over everyone. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. Was this some kind of twisted joke? My heart began to race as I started scanning the faces of the others in the room. Some looked just as confused as I felt, while others seemed to know exactly what was happening. The host then went on to reveal what I had suspected but hoped wasn't true. "There are cameras hidden in every room," they announced, with a gleam in their eye. "You're all part of my little experiment tonight." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of shuffling feet and nervous laughter. I could see the tension building, the discomfort turning into something darker. I wanted to leave, to escape, but the locked door reminded me that I couldn't. Panic began to rise in my chest as I processed what was happening. The host, still smiling, walked over to the living room and motioned toward the ceiling, where I noticed a small, almost invisible camera nestled in the corner. "You're all being recorded right now," they continued. "And everything you do, everything you say will be broadcasted live for my own amusement." It felt like I had stepped into a nightmare, and I was the unwilling participant in someone else's twisted game. I scanned the faces of the other guests, but no one seemed to know how to respond. Some were visibly uncomfortable, others were trying to laugh it off, as though this was all just an elaborate prank. But deep down I could tell no one was laughing. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. There was no escape, no way to turn back the clock and make everything normal again. The host moved through the room, adjusting the cameras as though they were inspecting some precious item. The guests continued to fidget, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what was expected of them. I felt the weight of every eye on me, the pressure mounting with every second that passed. The whole situation felt unreal, like I had been transported into some kind of horror movie. I could barely hear what the host was saying anymore, the words blurring into a muffled hum in the background. I glanced around the room again, and this time I noticed something that made my stomach churn. A few of the guests were behaving oddly, as though they had been here before. Their movements were too practiced, their responses too rehearsed. Were they part of this twisted game? Or were they as trapped as I was? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I found myself wishing for the moment when I could just walk out and leave this madness behind. But the host wasn't finished. "Let's see how everyone reacts when the pressure is on," they said with a twisted smile, and I felt my blood run cold. It was clear now that this wasn't some harmless prank. This was something much darker, a calculated experiment that would push us all to the edge. I could feel my body tensing as I realized that I was no longer in control of the situation. The room, once filled with laughter and warmth, had turned into a cage. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. I could hear the quiet rustle of clothing, the soft sound of footsteps, but there was no real conversation anymore. The room had become a pressure cooker, the silence suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the cameras, which seemed to be everywhere, watching our every move. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and no one seemed willing to break the silence. The host continued to move from one guest to another, their voice a constant drone in the background. But now it was as if they were testing each of us, watching how we would react to the pressure. One guest, a woman sitting near me, started to tremble uncontrollably. Her face was pale, and she kept looking around as though she were searching for an escape that didn't exist. I wanted to comfort her, but I knew that doing so would only draw attention to us. It wasn't until a few hours later that the host finally spoke again. "I think it's time to end the game," they said, their voice dripping with satisfaction. "You all passed the test. Congratulations, you're free to go." The key turned in the lock, and the door opened with a soft click. For a moment, no one moved. We were all too stunned, too scared to react. But as the door swung open, it felt like a floodgate had been released, and we all rushed out of the house, eager to leave behind the nightmare that had unfolded within those walls. As I stepped outside, I felt the cool night air hit my face, and I finally took a deep breath. The tension in my body began to ease, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just escaped something much worse. I glanced around, and to my relief, everyone seemed to be heading in different directions, no one speaking, no one looking back. It was as though we were all trying to forget what had just happened, to leave it behind as we moved on with our lives. The world outside seemed so much brighter, so much safer. But the images of those cameras, of the host's smile, haunted me. I didn't know what had driven them to do something like that, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never accept another invitation to their house again. Story 14. I woke up one Saturday morning, ready to begin the usual routine of coffee and a quiet moment before the house became a whirlwind of activity. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. My youngest child was still asleep, and the older ones had already gone out for a few errands. It was the perfect moment for peace, but when I stepped onto the porch to get the mail, something unusual caught my eye. Sitting right in the center of the porch, neatly placed, was a basket. At first glance, it seemed like an Easter basket, but the vibrant colors and ribbons were missing. The basket was simple, woven with dark wood and filled with shredded paper, but it was the contents that made me pause. There were no chocolates or colorful eggs. Instead, there were small, unmarked bottles filled with pills, all clearly expired, and a note tucked beneath them. I bent down to examine the note first. The handwriting was neat, even elegant, but it was the words that made my blood run cold. For your sins, the note read. No other explanation, no context, just those 3 words scrawled across the paper. I felt a chill run through me, and a wave of unease washed over me, but I tried to shake it off. It had to be a prank, a bizarre joke from someone who thought it would be funny to frighten me. I grabbed the basket, feeling the strange weight of it in my hands as I carried it inside. As I set it down on the kitchen table, I examined the pills. The bottles were old, and some of them were completely faded, but the pills inside were unmistakably expired, the labels torn and unreadable. I knew enough to understand that consuming them would be dangerous. There were no markings or instructions that could help identify what they were, and no explanation for why they had been left for me. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, telling myself it was just a mistake or a strange coincidence. But as I stared at the basket, the words from the note echoed in my mind, "For your sins." What sins? What did that even mean? I was a mother, just trying to get through life, doing the best I could. I thought of all the things I'd done wrong over the years, mistakes I'd made, choices I regretted, but nothing felt big enough to warrant this kind of message. My thoughts were interrupted when my toddler stirred in the other room, letting out a soft cry. I went to check on her, still clutching the basket with the pills and note, trying to push the unsettling thoughts out of my mind. I spent the next few hours caring for my child, preparing breakfast, and checking on my older kids. Life, for the moment, was moving on as it always did. Yet, in the back of my mind, the strange basket kept nagging at me. Later that afternoon, I told my husband about what had happened, but he was just as baffled as I was. He suggested it was probably some kind of joke, maybe even an attempt at scaring me. But his voice lacked the certainty it usually had, and I could tell that even he was starting to feel uneasy. He checked the porch, wondering if there were any cameras or signs of who might have left the basket, but everything appeared normal. No one else was around, and there was no trace of the person who could have placed it there. As the evening wore on, the feeling of dread didn't fade. Instead, it grew. Every little sound seemed to make me jump, every shadow a potential threat. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone watching from the street. But when I looked outside, everything seemed perfectly still. The quiet of the neighborhood almost made it worse. It was as if the silence was hiding something I wasn't supposed to know. That night, as I lay in bed, the words from the note repeated in my mind like a haunting chant. "For your sins." I could hear them over and over, growing louder in my head. What did I do to deserve this? I had tried to be a good person, hadn't I? Yes, I had my flaws, but who didn't? I was doing my best, juggling work, family, and life. Why would someone want to send me such a chilling message? I barely slept, tossing and turning as the weight of the basket's contents and the mysterious note weighed heavily on my mind. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen, that the basket wasn't just some random act, but something far more sinister. But I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let it consume me. I decided to go to the police station,